the angel speaking to the shepherds and so forth. We go over to Matthew, he doesn't say anything about any shepherds. To him, it's wise men. They're coming out of the east and from a foreign land and so forth. And so, rather than beat ourselves up about why Luke says one thing and Matthew another about the nativity, we can account for that at Christmas time by just having both. We can have both wise men and shepherds, and we've got it covered. And then we can look deeper and say, what is the message here? What is these scriptures telling us? Well, what they're telling me is that even a Jewish book of the Bible like Matthew, which is probably the most Jewish of all the books, he is saying that people came to the Nativity who were from a foreign land, that Christ was for them as well as he was for the Jews. And Luke is telling us that the shepherds who were not Jewish people, they were not Pharisees and scribes and so forth, that these poor shepherds with their smell and everything else were welcome to Christ. So that's the message that we get. And I think that to me makes the Bible a living document. When it becomes something that lives for us today in today's world, and we can interpret it in new and exciting ways, it's when it comes alive. We don't have to worry about this word or that word being different. So I want to move on now and start talking about what we really came here to talk about, but with that background. But there's if you will go to the chart that I have that looks like this. You will see that this chart is intended to, the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the synoptic gospel. Well, what that means is that, I think that means seen as one, or they're seen as the same thing, or telling the same story, that sort of thing. So it's obvious that much of the material in these three books is identical. But if you'll look at the chart, now Mark is a much shorter book than Luke or Matthew in terms of the number of verses. But you'll see that 76% from the chart of what is in the book of Mark also appears in Luke and Matthew. But in Luke, it comprises only 41% of the book of Luke and only 45% of the book of Matthew, because they are larger books. They have more verses. I think Mark only has 600 some verses, maybe. Matthew and Luke have like 1,000 or 1,050. I've got that in the notes somewhere. So that explains that. So I have an example somewhere in here of some of these, some 600 verses that are in Mark that also reappear in Luke and Matthew. In Mark, it says, for example, the verse Mark 2:13 through 17, it says, "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. You go on down a little bit, it says, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Then it says, "I have not come to call the righteousness, but sinners." Well, if you go over to Matthew, those verses that I just read appeared in Mark. But if you go to Matthew, then Matthew is almost repeating that word for word. He says, "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. "Why does your teacher eat with collectors and sinners? For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Follow me," Jesus said, and Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Well, I'm back down into Luke now. So that same thing, almost word for word. I'm screwing this up a little bit, but if you get the point that same thing appears again almost word for word in Luke. Luke says, "Follow me," Jesus said to him, and Levi got up and left everything and followed him. So the whole point here is that it has been accepted for eons that Matthew and Luke had the book of Mark as a source. they used the book of Mark as a source when they were writing. So that way you'll see that in the going back to the first page, that the book of Mark is going to predate, in scholars' estimation, the book of Matthew and Luke. So now, that has been accepted for a long time. Now, here's where we start to get into the fun part. And also in the book of Luke and Matthew, there are other verses that are common. They read exactly alike, and I gave some examples of those. Let's see. Okay. It goes where I have in the notes Q as a source. In Matthew 3, chapter 7, chapter 3, verses 7 through 10, it says, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? We have Abraham for our father, for as I say to you, that God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her? How often I wanted to gather your children together." Remember, well, you go over to Luke and you say, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" And it starts off and it repeats almost word for word what I just read. We have Abraham for our father, for I say to you that God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham, etc., etc. So, going back at least 150 years, scholars realize, wait a minute, that we have this material that is in the book of Luke and Matthew that looks like it was derived and pulled from the book of Mark. But we also have this other material that's identical. It's same thing, word for word, but it's not in Mark. None of this material that I just read is in Mark. Where did it come from? So in 1835, some German scholars came up with the theory that there is a lost book that was the source of this material. That when Matthew and Luke wrote their Gospels, they had at their disposal a book that we no longer have. And that's where what we're talking about today. In this lost book, they refer to it in German as Quelle, Quelle. But it has been shortened and now it's just been known as the Gospel of Q. So that is the book that is this book, the Gospel of Q. And so that is the source of, according to what most scholars believe, it probably at least 90% of scholars, to this material that is no longer, that is not in the book of Mark. Now, one thing that happened in 1945 that gave a tremendous amount of credibility to the Q theory was that there were, in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, there were two sort of Bedouin guys out looking for fertilizer. They were digging in the ground looking for richer dirt, I guess what we would call compost or something like that. And they ran into this huge jar that was maybe this big, and it was sealed at the top of the thing, and they had no idea what it was. They dug it up, they took it home. They were almost afraid to open it. They didn't know whether it contained evil spirits or what. Finally, they decided they would crack it open. When they cracked it open, there was a lot of these codices in there that we talked about. Books bound in gazelle hide and laced up, and so there were 12 or 13 books in there, maybe a few more, because for the next few months they used some of them for firewood. So they had no idea that these were of any importance. But word finally got out that archaeologists and Bible scholars all found out that these things had been discovered, and finally a great percentage of them ended up for review and study. And so there's about, in these 12 books, there are maybe 65 or 70 different minor subjects and books in there, and one of the things that's in there is the Gospel of Thomas. which is a gospel that is not in the New Testament canon. And one of the problems that scholars had with the Q theory, it was that obviously the Q theory is a little bit different from normal books in the New Testament because it is a sayings gospel. It doesn't contain narrative information. It doesn't tell anything about Jesus as a child, how he grew up, has no nativity scenes or anything like that in it. It is sayings. But then when they discovered the Gospel of Thomas, they said, wait a minute, here is another sayings gospel. The Gospel of Thomas is about 112 sayings of Jesus. And it starts out, and every one of those sayings starts out, and Jesus said, and Jesus said, and Jesus said. And there's about 112 sayings in there that are attributed to the writer of that. Incidentally, there's another book that it starts out and it tells who wrote it. It said, I, Didymus Judas Thomas, am writing down these sayings of Jesus. Well, who is Didymus Judas Thomas? Well, Didymus is a word that means twin, I think, Robert. And so there are theories and speculations that Jesus had a twin brother back in some of the olden traditions that were passed down. But scholars do not think that they think that someone gave this name. They don't know who wrote the Gospel of Thomas, that this was a name that was just given to it. But it is sort of interesting. The Gospel of Thomas is also published, of course, like this. But the Gospel of Thomas discovery at Nag Hammadi in 1945 gave a great deal more credibility to the existence of the Q Gospel for two reasons. One is that it was a sayings gospel, as I have said, which reinforced the fact that there were gospels that were sayings gospel and did not contain narrative information. But the second thing was that the Gospel of Thomas itself seemed to have information in it that probably came from the Q source. So Q was not only a source for Matthew and Luke, but probably a source for the Gospel of Thomas also. The Gospel of Thomas was written, and the one that they found was written in about 400 CE, and it was written in Coptic. But they knew that it had been written in Greek, that it came from Greek, because there was already a fragment of it that had been discovered. Incidentally, I forgot to mention, when we talk about the New Testament canon, the 27 books, there are no original books of the New Testament. There are no books that someone could say this is the original book of Matthew or something. They're not even any copy, second copies, the first copy. The earliest even fragment of a New Testament, of the 27 books of the New Testament, is about the size of a business card. It comes from the book of John. And they estimated somewhere around 130 to 150 CE. So it's that long after the crucifixion of Christ that we have any even fragments of what turned out to be the 27 books of the New Testament. But anyway, going back to the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas, so that reinforced in sort of a final analysis of the prior existence of the Q Gospel. One of the things that I thought it would be interesting to discuss this information, share this information with y'all, is not just the fact of sort of a, well, how about that type of thing, but sort of what the Q Gospel might have looked like. That's what sort of interests me, because if it could very possibly be the very earliest written book of referring to the sayings of Jesus Christ. That's why I put in your notes on the very back page a photo that, or picture, that sort of, in my mind, sort of takes us back to perhaps a very early time when Jesus was just going into his ministry, probably still during the time that John the Baptist was also going through the countryside and preaching and that, and so I just found this one picture that sort of spoke to me as being the way I would visualize the time of the Gospel of Q. So, I don't know that is true. It's just the thinking. The Gospel of Q contains some of the most important things about the teaching of Jesus. You remember in the Bonhoeffer class, we talked about Bonhoeffer, that his favorite part of the Bible was the Sermon on the Mount. Well, the Sermon on the Mount is contained in the Gospel of Q. The Lord's Prayer, which is critical to all of our reading of Scripture, is contained in the Gospel of Q. So it depicts a very early Jesus that was going through the countryside, probably without a whole lot of followers, and just giving out these sayings that were handed down to his disciples later on and others to come later. So I think it's exciting. So part of your notes, I don't think you need to perhaps, unless you just interested in to buy the Gospel of Q here, but that writing that I gave you there as part of your notes, that was by this James Robinson was a scholar who devoted most of his life to the study and reconstruction of the Gospel of Q. And he had at one time as many as 150 biblical scholars is a group working with him in recreating what might have been contained in the Gospel of Q. He was a professor of religion and director of Institute for Antiquity at Claremont Graduate School. And this document here that I put as part of your notes is a lecture that he gave at Princeton Theological Seminary in 1997. And so there's enough good data in here that will tell you mostly what he would want, if he were here, would want to tell you about what was contained in the Gospel of Q and in what form it was. And he'll also go into some detail as to the purity of those original sayings of Jesus and how that they haven't, to him, the source is the least compromised source of Jesus' actual words. He's passed away now, but there's still a tremendous amount of Q work going on. There's a theologian and a Bible scholar named Burton Mack who's just written a brand new book on the Gospel of Q. So I think you'll find this worthwhile to read. And I think going back to sort of where we started, it brings a sort of a freshness to it to me to take a look at something like this, and I think it's interesting to try to go back as far as we can. And you know, we talk about the 27 books of the New Testament, and we talk about that some have been lost, some have been found, maybe some were left out, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that I think, and I've spent some time on this, is that I think that and perhaps it's the Holy Spirit or something, but I think the 27 books of the New Testament were the right 27 for the most part. And I think that if we started over today and we said, let's